Holding a $35 million check feels heavy. But do you know what feels heavier? Realizing the man who kissed you goodbye this morning legally became a stranger to you 62 days ago. My name is Audrey Sterling. I'm 38 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I restored some of the most beautiful buildings in Boston for a living. Brownstones on Commonwealth Avenue. A chapel in Beacon Hill that developers wanted to gut and I fought to save. I understood old wood, cracked plaster, and buildings that had survived worse than they looked like they could survive. I thought I understood people the same way. I was wrong about one person in particular, and that mistake is the reason I'm telling you this. I stood in the glass-walled reception of Vance & Partners on a Tuesday morning in October, holding a manila folder that contained the single most important document of my adult life, ready to tell my husband that our money problems were finally, completely over. He wasn't in his office. His lawyer was standing behind his desk instead, straightening his tie in the reflection of a window that overlooked the harbor. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, not looking up right away. "Audrey. Please sit." I didn't sit. "Where's Julian?" He slid a document across the mahogany desk instead of answering. The paper made a small, dry sound against the wood, the kind of sound that means nothing until you understand what it means. "Sign here to acknowledge receipt of the final dissolution." I stared at the date printed in the header. August 14th. I read it twice because the first time, my brain simply refused the information. 62 days earlier, while I was sitting in a hospital room on the 9th floor of Massachusetts General, holding my mother's hand while a ventilator breathed for her, my husband had filed for divorce. Uncontested. Finalized. Notarized. While I sat in that room memorizing the sound of my mother's heart monitor, Julian had already made me a stranger. And he had no idea that in exactly 11 minutes, I was going to tell him he'd just walked away from $35 million. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without the 6 months before it. I met Julian Vance 9 years ago at a fundraiser for the Boston Preservation Alliance. He was handsome in the specific way that private equity men are handsome: expensive haircut, a watch that cost more than my first car, a laugh that made you feel like you were the only interesting person in the room. I was 30 and recently divorced from a career I loved, but that didn't love me back financially. Restoration work doesn't pay like development work. Julian's family had been in Boston real estate for 3 generations. His firm, Vance & Partners, specialized in luxury conversions, old mill buildings turned into condos that sold for $4 million to people who'd never once thought about the men who built the original walls. I fell for him fast, and I fell for him the way people fall for things they want to be true. He told me I was the only person who understood what buildings actually meant. He told me his firm was solid, growing, respected. For 6 years, that was mostly true. For the last 3, it stopped being true, and I didn't know it, because Julian had gotten very good at making failure look like a temporary inconvenience. His flaw wasn't cruelty, not at first. It was pride. Julian Vance could not tolerate being seen as anything less than the man who had it handled. So when Vance & Partners started bleeding money, bad loans on a waterfront project that stalled during permitting, 2 lawsuits from subcontractors who hadn't been paid, a credit line that had quietly ballooned to $11 million, he didn't tell me. He smiled at dinner parties and told our friends the Seaport project was ahead of schedule. I found out how bad it was in March, the same week my mother's cancer came back for the 3rd time. "We need you to sign the personal guarantee on the corporate loan," Julian told me one night, sliding a stack of papers across our kitchen island the way he'd later slide papers across a different desk. "It's just a formality, Audrey. The bank wants both our signatures because the house is in both our names." I should have asked more questions. That's my flaw, if you're looking for one. I trust people I love more than I trust the paperwork in front of me. I signed. I didn't fully understand until much later that I hadn't just co-signed a loan. I had personally guaranteed $11 million of his company's debt with everything I owned, including the restoration business I'd spent a decade building. 3 weeks after that, my mother was admitted to the hospital for the last time. I want to tell you about the tablets now, because this is the part of the story that took me the longest to understand, and understanding it is what eventually saved me. In April, Julian started bringing me a small amber pill bottle every evening with dinner. For the stress, he said. Dr. Whitfield prescribed it. You've been forgetting things, sweetheart. You left the stove on last week. You called Marcus by your father's name. I didn't remember leaving the stove on. I didn't remember calling my brother by my dead father's name. But grief does strange things to memory, and I was grieving in advance, the specific exhausting grief of watching someone die slowly while still needing to function every day. So I took the pills. I trusted him. And over the following weeks, I started to genuinely believe something was wrong with my mind. I forgot appointments. I stood in my own kitchen once and couldn't remember why I'd walked in. I cried more than I'd ever cried in my life, and less predictably, and Julian would watch me with an expression I mistook for concern. It was concern. Just not for me. I didn't know yet that Dr. Whitfield wasn't a real doctor's prescription pad. It was a name Julian paid a compliant physician in Providence to put on paperwork. I didn't know the tablets weren't anti-anxiety medication. I didn't know that every symptom I was experiencing, the confusion, the memory lapses, the emotional volatility, was being carefully documented in a file that Julian's divorce attorney would later present to a judge as evidence that I was, in the language of the court filing, exhibiting signs of cognitive instability inconsistent with sound decision-making capacity. I found out what those pills actually were from my own brother, but that comes later. Right now, in April, I only knew that I felt like I was disappearing, and the one person I trusted to catch me was the person quietly making sure I fell. My mother died on June 3rd, at 4:47 in the morning, with me holding her hand and Julian conspicuously absent, working late at the office, he said. I remember almost nothing about the 2 weeks after her death. I remember the funeral. I remember Julian's arm around my shoulders at the graveside, and photographers from a local business magazine somehow present to capture Boston power couple Julian and Audrey Van Sterling, looking appropriately solemn, a photo that later ran in a piece praising Julian's resilience during a difficult family season, without a single mention of what he was doing to me in private. What I did not know, during those 2 weeks, was that Julian's attorney had already filed the divorce petition. Uncontested. My signature on the response was there, a signature I have no memory of giving, on a stack of documents Julian told me were estate paperwork for your mother's affairs, that he needed me to initial while I sat in the hospital family lounge, exhausted, medicated, and grieving in real time. I signed. I always signed. That was the whole design. Here's what Julian didn't know, sitting in his office that Tuesday morning, while his lawyer slid a divorce acknowledgement across a mahogany desk to a woman he assumed was too broken to fight back. My mother's estate wasn't just a modest life insurance payout and a paid-off house in Wellesley. My mother, Catherine Sterling, had spent 40 years quietly building a private trust that neither Julian nor I had any idea existed, assets from a family shipping business my grandfather started in the 1960s, invested conservatively and compounded for 4 decades. $35,400,000, held in a trust that named exactly one beneficiary. Me. Audrey Catherine Sterling. Not Audrey Vance. Sterling. Arthur Pendleton, my mother's attorney for over 20 years, and a man Julian had met exactly twice at holiday parties and dismissed both times, as some old family friend, called me 8 days after the funeral and asked me to come to his office alone. Your mother built something extraordinary, Audrey, he told me, sliding a folder across his own desk, a gentler gesture than the one waiting for me weeks later. And she built it in a way that protects it. This trust was never marital property. It's yours entirely, regardless of your marital status. I sat in that office and cried for a different reason than I'd been crying for months. I felt, for the first time since April, something close to relief. I thought about walking into Julian's office and telling him our money problems were over. I thought about how his face would look when he heard the number. I imagined, God help me, that this would fix something between us, that I could save him, save us, the way I'd spent my whole career saving buildings other people had given up on. I had no idea he'd already erased me from the paperwork of his life 2 months earlier. I had no idea that the man I was rushing to rescue had already thrown me away. I walked into Vance and Partners with the good news of my life folded into a manila envelope, and I walked out holding a piece of paper with a date on it that told me everything I'd believed about my marriage for the past 9 years was a story someone else had been writing the entire time. "Where's Julian?" I asked his lawyer again, my voice flatter now, because something in my chest had gone very cold and very still. He finally looked up at me, and there was something in his expression I would spend the next several weeks understanding fully. It wasn't guilt. It was pity, the specific, condescending pity of a man who believed he was looking at a woman too damaged to know what had been done to her. "Mrs. Vance," he said, deliberately using the name I no longer legally had a right to, "Julian asked me to handle this personally. Given your recent health circumstances, he felt it would be less stressful for you to receive this information from counsel." Recent health circumstances. I stood very still in that glass office with the harbor gray and rippling behind him, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was standing inside a story someone had constructed about me, a story where I was fragile, forgetful, unstable, easy to erase. A story built out of amber pill bottles and quiet lies, and a signature I didn't remember giving in a hospital family lounge. I looked down at the folder still in my hands. $35,400,000. A number Julian didn't know existed. A number that, as of that morning, legally belonged to a woman he'd already decided didn't matter enough to keep. I closed the folder. I didn't sign the acknowledgement on the desk. "Tell Julian," I said, "that I'll be in touch. Through my own attorney." I walked out of that office already knowing 3 things with total certainty. First, that everything I'd believed about the last 6 months of my marriage had been a carefully built lie. Second, that whatever Julian thought he'd escaped by divorcing me quietly while I was too broken to notice, he had actually just made the single worst financial decision of his life. And third, though I didn't fully understand this piece yet, not until my brother Marcus called me 4 days later with results from a lab test I hadn't asked him to run, that the person who'd taught Julian how to destroy me so precisely wasn't a divorce attorney at all. It was someone I had trusted with my own designs, my own name, and my own home for over a year. Someone who was about to find out that I don't disappear quietly. I rebuild. Marcus called me on a Saturday morning, 4 days after I walked out of Vance and Partners, and the first thing he said wasn't hello. "Audrey, where are the pill bottles? The ones Julian's been giving you. Do you still have any?" My brother is a toxicologist at a research lab affiliated with Tufts, the kind of scientist who reads ingredient labels on shampoo, and once spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner explaining acetaminophen metabolism to our very bored extended family. He does not call people at 8 in the morning to ask about pill bottles unless something has already alarmed him. "There are 2 left in the medicine cabinet," I said. "Why?" "Bring them to the lab today. Don't take another one." "I mean it, Audrey, don't take another pill until I've had them tested." I didn't ask him to explain over the phone, because I already knew, somewhere underneath the part of my brain that was still protecting Julian's version of events, that I didn't want the answer shouted at me in a kitchen. I drove the bottles to his lab that afternoon. I sat in a plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner, while my brother ran a full spectroscopy panel, and I thought about every strange, foggy afternoon of the past 6 months, and I waited. It took 3 hours. When Marcus came back into the hallway, he was holding a printout, and his hands were not steady. "These aren't anxiety medication," he said. "There's no benzodiazepine in here at all. This is a combination of an antihistamine at triple the standard dose, and a low-grade sedative that isn't even approved for outpatient prescription in Massachusetts. Audrey, this combination doesn't treat anxiety. It causes the exact symptoms you've been describing to me for months. The fog. The memory lapses. The mood swings. Someone built this specifically to make you look unstable." I sat in that hallway and felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut since April, since the first night Julian slid an amber bottle across our kitchen island and called it concern. Whose prescription is on the label? I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't recognize the name. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, Marcus read. I called the medical board an hour ago while you were driving here. There's no licensed physician by that name registered in Massachusetts. The DEA number on the label doesn't correspond to anyone real. Someone printed a fake label and put it on real, unregulated pills, and someone has been giving them to you every night for 6 months. I want to tell you I felt rage first. I didn't. I felt something closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing the floor you've been standing on was never solid at all. I thought about every time Julian had gently corrected my memory of an event. No, sweetheart, that's not what happened, you're confused again, and I understood, with a sickness that moved through my whole body, that he hadn't been managing my illness. He had been manufacturing it. I didn't confront Julian that week. This is the part people don't understand about betrayal on this scale. You don't get angry immediately. You get careful. I had spent 9 years learning how Julian thought, how he protected himself, how he always had a second explanation ready before the first one finished falling apart. If I walked into our house and screamed at him, he would simply produce Dr. Whitfield's paperwork, tell me I was confused again, and I would have nothing but my brother's lab report against an entire fabricated medical history. So instead, I did what I do for a living. I studied the structure before I decided how to take it apart. I started with Elena Ross. Elena had been my interior design collaborator for 14 months, ever since I brought her in on the Beacon Hill Chapel restoration. She was 29, talented in a way I genuinely admired, and I had done more for her career than I'd done for almost anyone's. I introduced her to 3 of my biggest clients. I gave her co-credit on a project that ran in a regional design magazine, credit she absolutely did not have to share. I trusted her enough to give her a key to my studio, because half our collaboration happened after hours, sketching over wine, arguing about materials. What I hadn't noticed, what I had been too exhausted and medicated to notice, which I now understood was precisely the point, was how often Elena had been at our house in the past 6 months. Working late with Julian on investor materials for the Seaport project. Present at 3 separate dinners I barely remembered attending. In my own kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in July, according to a receipt I found from a wine delivery service, while I was at my mother's memorial service planning meeting alone. I called my studio assistant, Priya, and asked her a question I already suspected the answer to. Has Elena been submitting any of my archival sketches to outside firms? The chapel drafts, specifically. The early concept work from before we brought in the client. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before Priya said a single word. I found a submission portfolio on the shared drive 2 weeks ago under Elena's folder, she said carefully. I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure it was my place. It had 6 of your original concept sketches in it. Elena's name was on the cover page. Not yours. 6 sketches. My work, my hand, my name erased and replaced with hers, submitted somewhere I still didn't know the destination of yet. I sat with that information for exactly 1 night before the next piece arrived and made the picture considerably worse. The next piece came from Arthur Pendleton, and it arrived in the form of a phone call I will remember for the rest of my life. Audrey, he said, I need you to come to my office. There's something in your mother's private files I think you need to see before you make any decisions about the divorce filing. My mother, it turned out, had kept records. Not sentimental ones, legal ones, financial ones, the kind of documentation a woman who built a 40-year trust in complete secrecy naturally accumulates. Among them was a file, nearly 2 decades old, involving a man named Richard Ross. Your father and Richard Ross were business partners for 11 years, Arthur told me, sliding a folder across his desk, the 3rd folder to change my life in the span of a month. Sterling and Ross Development. In 2004, Richard forged your father's signature on a set of investment documents and diverted $8 million out of the company's holdings before your father discovered it. Your father chose not to press criminal charges, largely because the scandal would have destroyed the reputations of every family involved, including yours. He simply dissolved the partnership and let Richard walk away, quietly, with what he'd stolen. I stared at the name in the file. Ross. The same last name as the woman who'd been in my kitchen, in my marriage, in my professional archive, systematically taking things that belonged to me. Richard Ross has one daughter, Arthur said, watching my face as the connection assembled itself in real time. Elena Ross. Born in 2, raised primarily in Providence after the family relocated following your father's dissolution of the partnership. Audrey, I don't believe Elena entered your professional life by accident. I believe she has known exactly who you are since before she ever walked into your studio. I sat in my car outside Arthur's office for almost 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home, running the entire architecture of the last 14 months back through my mind with this new information layered underneath it like a second blueprint suddenly visible beneath the first. Elena hadn't drifted into my orbit through mutual friends at a gallery opening, the story she'd told me the day we met. She had built her way in, deliberately, patiently, the daughter of a man my father had chosen mercy over justice with 2 decades earlier, and she had used that mercy as an entry point into everything I owned. She had gotten close enough to steal my designs. Close enough to be in my home, while a fabricated prescription slowly eroded my credibility. Close enough, I now understood with total certainty, to have coached Julian on exactly how to build a case against my own mind. I thought about the toxicology report sitting in my brother's lab. I thought about 6 of my sketches carrying someone else's name on a cover page. I thought about a divorce filed 62 days before I'd been told about it, timed with surgical precision to a week, when I was too devastated by my mother's death to notice anything at all. None of this was luck. None of this was Julian acting alone in a moment of panic about failing finances. This was constructed, piece by piece, by 2 people who had spent over a year deciding exactly how to take everything I had, and make it look like my own instability had caused the loss. What they didn't know, what Julian in particular had no idea about, sitting in his office believing he'd walked away clean, with the marital debt safely reassigned to a woman he'd successfully painted as unfit, was that I had just found out about a trust worth $35 million for days before his lawyer slid that divorce acknowledgement across the desk. They thought they'd left me with nothing. They had actually left me, for the first time in 9 years, with something Julian Vance had never once had to contend with in his life. Complete financial independence, full clarity about exactly who had betrayed me and why, and absolutely nothing left to lose by making all of it public. I drove home that night, sat down at my own kitchen island, the same island where the amber pill bottles had appeared every evening for 6 months, and started making a list. Not of grievances. Of documents. Bank records, the fake prescription, the stolen sketches, Richard Ross's 20-year-old forgery file, the wine delivery receipts, the timeline of a divorce filed in secret. I had spent my entire career learning how to read a building, and find the one structural weakness that would bring the whole thing down without warning. Julian Vance was about to learn that I could read people exactly the same way. I didn't hire a divorce attorney first. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Renata Cole, and she came recommended by Arthur Pendleton with a single sentence I've thought about often since. She doesn't just find the money, he told me. She finds the moment someone decided to hide it. I met her in a small office above a bakery in the North End, and I spent 3 hours laying out everything I had. The fake prescription. The stolen sketches. The wine receipts. Richard Ross's 20-year-old forgery file. Renata listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she asked me a question that reframed the entire situation. Do you have access to the corporate accounts for Vance and Partners? I still did. My signature was on the personal guarantee, which meant I was a legal cosigner, with visibility into certain financial disclosures Julian had likely forgotten I could still request. Renata's eyes changed when I said that, the specific quiet focus of someone who has just found the loose thread on a very expensive sweater. 2 weeks of quiet, methodical work followed. I want to be honest with you about this part, because it wasn't cinematic. It was subpoenaed bank statements and late nights and Renata flagging line items with a yellow highlighter, while I sat across from her drinking coffee that had gone cold twice. But what we found, piece by piece, was the actual shape of what Julian and Elena had built together. Vance and Partners wasn't just struggling. It was $11.4 million in debt across four separate creditors, two of whom had already filed liens against the Seaport project. Julian had been personally siphoning company funds into a separate account for 8 months, an account that had made 6 payments, totaling $320,000, to a shell company called Ross Creative Holdings. Elena's company. He's been paying her, Renata said, tapping the highlighted line items. Not just having an affair with her, Audrey. He's been funneling company money to her for almost a year. This isn't romance. This is a business relationship with romance attached to it. I sat with that for a long time. It confirmed something I'd suspected since Arthur first said Richard Ross's name out loud, but confirming it on paper still landed differently than suspecting it in my chest. Elena hadn't seduced Julian into destroying me as a side effect of an affair. The affair was the mechanism. The actual transaction was money and my professional archive, moving quietly from my life into hers, with Julian as the willing conduit. The next discovery came from my own studio, and it was Priya who found it, 3 days after I asked her to dig deeper into the shared drive. "Audrey, I think you need to see this before you decide anything," she said, and her voice had the particular flatness of someone bracing you for something. She forwarded me an email chain. Elena, corresponding with a firm called Ross Whitmore Development, a company I recognized instantly because I'd spent an entire dinner party 6 years earlier listening to my mother describe, in careful, controlled language, the man who'd built it out of the $8 million he stole from my father. Richard Ross was still running the company he'd built on that theft. And Elena had been sending him my architectural concept work for 11 months, positioning it as her own portfolio for a submission to acquire the exclusive restoration contract for 3 historic properties in the Back Bay, a contract I had personally been in early conversations for before Elena, my trusted collaborator, quietly began undermining me from inside my own studio. The email that broke something loose in my chest wasn't even the most damning one. It was a short message from Elena to her father, dated the week of my mother's funeral. "Julian's finally moving on the divorce. Audrey's distracted with the funeral, won't notice the timing. Should have the Back Bay contract locked before she's stable enough to fight for it. This works out better than we planned." Better than we planned. I read that sentence perhaps a dozen times. Not because I didn't understand it, I understood it immediately and completely, but because I needed my body to catch up to what my mind already knew. Elena hadn't simply exploited a vulnerable moment. She had been waiting for one, tracking my mother's declining health, timing the divorce filing to a week she calculated I would be too shattered to notice or resist. I closed my laptop and sat in my studio in complete silence for almost an hour. Then I called Renata and told her I was ready to move. Preparation is not a montage. It's tedious and it requires more patience than rage ever will, and I learned that the hard way over the following month. Renata's forensic report went to my divorce attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Diane Okafor who specialized in cases involving what she called manufactured incapacity, a legal term, it turned out, for exactly what had been done to me. Diane's first move wasn't to file anything publicly. It was to quietly petition the court to reopen the divorce proceeding on the grounds of fraud upon the court, submitting my brother's toxicology report alongside documentation that Dr. Eleanor Whitfield did not exist as a licensed medical professional in the state. "Judges don't like being lied to," Diane told me, in the calm, almost bored tone of someone who has watched 100 men underestimate the women divorcing them. Julian's entire uncontested filing was built on the premise that you were mentally unfit to participate in your own divorce. We now have physical, lab-verified proof that his justification for that claim was manufactured with a fake prescription and a fictional doctor. That's not a messy divorce anymore, Audrey. That's fraud. That's potentially criminal. While Diane worked the legal channel, I worked a different one entirely. I called Arthur Pendleton and asked him a question I'd been circling for weeks. How quickly could I acquire distressed debt on a private company if I had the capital and the right introductions? Arthur was quiet for a moment. Faster than most people think, if the debt holder wants to sell. Why? I told him about the $11.4 million Vance and Partners owed across four creditors. I told him two of those creditors had already filed liens and were, according to Renata's research, actively looking to offload the debt at a discount rather than wait through a lengthy collection process. Arthur understood what I was asking before I finished the sentence. You want to buy your husband's debt. I want to own it, I said. Every dollar of it. Before he knows I know anything. Over the following 3 weeks, using a private acquisition vehicle Arthur helped me structure through the trust, I purchased 91% of Vance and Partners' outstanding debt at a negotiated discount, paying just under $9 million for obligations with a face value of $11.4 million. Julian, still believing his divorce had cleanly separated him from any financial entanglement with me, had no idea that the creditors calling his office with increasingly aggressive collection language now answered quietly to me. I also learned, through Renata's continued digging, that Julian had scheduled a major public event for the second week of November, the Boston Preservation Gala, an annual black tie fundraiser where Vance and Partners intended to announce a new joint venture. The partner in that venture was Ross Whitmore Development. Julian and Elena, together, on stage, announcing a partnership built on stolen architectural work, a fabricated psychiatric history, and debt they no longer actually controlled. I had spent 9 years married to a man who believed presentation was the same thing as substance. He was about to learn the difference in front of every person whose opinion he had ever cared about. I want to tell you about the last piece, because it's the piece that turned preparation into something closer to certainty. I went to the gala committee, quietly, using my restoration credentials and my mother's decades-long reputation within Boston's preservation community, and I secured a keynote slot of my own, a 15-minute presentation on the Beacon Hill Chapel restoration, the same project Elena had stolen sketches from, scheduled for the same evening, immediately before Julian and Elena's joint announcement. Nobody on the committee knew what I intended to do with those 15 minutes. I hadn't fully decided myself, not yet, not until the final week, when Marcus called me with one more piece of information that completed the entire structure. I ran a deeper analysis on the second pill bottle, he told me. There's a compound in here in trace amounts I initially missed. It's not something that's supposed to be combined with the sedative at all. Audrey, at the dosage and frequency you described, over 6 months, this combination doesn't just cause confusion. Sustained exposure creates measurable risk of long-term cognitive damage. This wasn't designed to make you look temporarily unstable for a court filing. He paused, and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. This was designed to actually make you unstable. Permanently, if it went on long enough. I sat with the phone against my ear in my studio, surrounded by 9 years of drafts and blueprints and the careful, patient work of rebuilding beautiful things out of ruins, and I understood, finally and completely, exactly what I was walking into that gala to do. This was never going to be a story about a woman quietly reclaiming her dignity and walking away. Julian Vance and Elena Ross had spent a year building a plan to erase me financially, professionally, and, I now knew, physically, timed with surgical precision to the worst week of my life. I had spent that same year, without either of them realizing it, quietly buying the ground they were standing on. The gala was 9 days away. I had the debt. I had the fraud documentation. I had a toxicology report proving deliberate harm. And in 6 days, Diane Okafor would file a motion in open court to void the divorce entirely on the grounds of fraud, a motion timed, deliberately, to become public record the same week as the Preservation Gala. Julian believed he was about to announce the biggest deal of his career on that stage. He had no idea he was about to lose everything in front of every person who had ever mattered to him, on the same night, in the same room, with me holding the microphone. The Boston Preservation Gala is held every November in the Grand Ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, under 3 restored crystal chandeliers. I had personally overseen the rewiring of 4 years earlier. I remember standing beneath them that night in a dark green gown, holding a small flash drive in my clutch instead of a phone, and thinking that I understood, better than anyone else in that room, exactly how much weight a structure could hold before it failed. I gave my keynote first as scheduled. 15 minutes on the Beacon Hill Chapel restoration, the original stained glass we'd saved, the load-bearing analysis that let us preserve the bell tower without gutting its interior. I didn't mention Elena's name once. I didn't need to. I simply projected the original dated sketches on the screen behind me, my sketches, time-stamped and watermarked from my studio's archive system, the same drawings that had appeared 6 weeks earlier under a different name in a submission portfolio to Ross Whitmore Development. I watched Elena's face from the stage as 300 people in the room, many of them the exact preservation community whose respect she'd been quietly building for over a year, saw the true authorship laid out in plain, undeniable dates. I stepped down to polite applause and a standing ovation from Arthur, who had positioned himself at a table near the front with a folder of his own resting beside his water glass. Then Julian walked onto that stage. He looked exactly like the man I married. Confident, relaxed, a champagne flute in one hand, already smiling at the audience before he'd said a single word. Elena stood beside him in a pale gold dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and for one brief moment I felt something that surprised me. Not rage. Something closer to pity, the specific pity you feel watching someone walk toward a door they don't know is already locked. Tonight, Julian began, I'm thrilled to announce a partnership that represents the future of Boston development. Vance and Partners and Ross Whitmore Development are joining forces on 3 of the most significant historic properties in Back Bay. He gestured toward the screen behind him, where his team had queued up renderings of the properties, glossy and confident, ready to project an image of stability that no longer existed anywhere behind the scenes. The renderings never appeared. Instead, the screen filled with a document I had spent the previous 9 days making absolutely certain the gala's audiovisual technician would load at exactly this moment, a technician I had quietly retained through the same events committee that had given me my keynote slot. It was my brother's toxicology report, magnified across a 12-foot screen for 300 of Boston's most influential preservationists, developers, and journalists to read in full. Beneath it, Diane Okafor's motion to void the divorce on grounds of fraud, filed and stamped by the court that very morning, timed precisely so the public record would be active before the gala began. The room went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when everyone simultaneously understands they are witnessing something they will describe to other people for years. Julian turned toward the screen, and I watched 9 years of careful confidence drain out of his face in real time. This is a technical error, he said into the microphone, his voice climbing half an octave. We'll get this sorted. It's not an error, Julian. I walked back onto the stage, and I did not raise my voice because I didn't need to. Every phone in that ballroom was already recording. That's a toxicology report confirming the medication you gave me every night for 6 months wasn't anxiety treatment. It was an unregulated combination drug, prescribed under a fake doctor's license, designed to produce the exact symptoms you and your attorney later used in court to argue I was mentally unfit to participate in my own divorce. My brother is a toxicologist. He's already submitted this report to the Massachusetts Medical Board and the district attorney's office. I let that sit in the air for exactly as long as it needed to. And that motion beneath it was filed this morning. A judge has agreed to review whether our divorce was obtained through fraud upon the court. Which means, as of 9 o'clock this morning, there is a real legal possibility that you and I are still married, Julian. Which matters because I have some information I'd like to share with everyone in this room about what that would mean for tonight's announcement. Elena had gone very still beside him, and I turned toward her before Julian could recover enough to speak. Elena's father is Richard Ross, I said, and I watched the recognition land across the room in a slow wave, older attendees who remembered the Sterling and Ross partnership 2 decades earlier, younger ones pulling the name up on their phones in real time. 20 years ago, he forged my father's signature and diverted $8 million out of a company they built together. My father chose not to press charges. He simply let Richard Ross walk away with what he'd stolen, quietly, to protect both families from the scandal. I looked directly at Elena now. Your father spent 2 decades rebuilding a company on money he stole from mine. And you spent the last 14 months inside my studio, inside my marriage, and inside my home, systematically taking my architectural work and funneling it into a submission for exactly the kind of contract your father's company was built to chase. I have the emails, Elena. The one to your father the week of my mother's funeral was particularly informative. Should have the Back Bay contract locked before she's stable enough to fight for it. I believe you wrote this works out better than we planned. Elena's face had gone the color of the tablecloths. Somewhere near the back of the room, I watched an older man rise from his seat, his expression unreadable, and begin walking toward the exit without a word. I found out 3 days later that this was Richard Ross himself, who had come to witness what he believed would be his daughter's triumphant public announcement, and instead watched, in front of the entire industry he'd spent 20 years trying to rebuild credibility within, his daughter's methods exposed alongside his own 2-decade-old fraud. He didn't speak to Elena again that night. According to 2 people who were near him, he told an associate on his way out that he was not interested in inheriting someone else's federal problem, and Ross Whitmore Development quietly withdrew from the Back Bay partnership announcement within 48 hours, severing itself from both Julian and Elena in a press release that never once used either of their names. Julian was still standing at the podium when I turned back to him, and I watched him make one last attempt at control, the same instinct that had carried him through 9 years of quietly managing every crisis with a confident voice and a reassuring smile. Audrey, whatever you think you know. I don't think I know it, Julian. I own it. I said this quietly, and I watched him not understand for a full 3 seconds, which was long enough for me to finish. Vance & Partners owes $11.4 million across for creditors. I purchased 91% of that debt 6 weeks ago through a private acquisition vehicle. I own the majority of your company's outstanding obligations. Which means, effective tonight, I am formally calling that debt due in full, in accordance with the terms your creditors originally signed. You don't have $11 million, Julian. You never had $11 million. You had a company that looked solvent because I never asked hard enough questions, and I have spent the last 2 months asking every question I should have asked 2 years ago. I set my clutch down on the podium and opened it, removing a single folded document, the one piece of paper I had carried with me all evening. This is a formal notice of default and immediate collection, effective as of tonight, on behalf of the majority debt holder of Vance & Partners. Copies have already been filed with the court and delivered to your remaining creditors. You have 30 days to satisfy this debt in full, or the company's assets, including the Seaport project, the Back Bay holdings, and every remaining contract, transfer to me as the controlling creditor. 2 uniformed officers entered the ballroom from the side entrance near the kitchen, unhurried, professional, clearly having been positioned there in advance through arrangements Diane Okafor had made with the district attorney's office once the toxicology evidence had been formally submitted that week. I hadn't known the exact timing myself until that moment. I only knew Diane had told me, 3 days earlier, that fabricating a medical prescription and administering an unregulated compound to a spouse without consent moved a case out of family court and into criminal territory very quickly once documented. Julian saw them before most of the room did, and something in his posture finally, completely collapsed. I didn't watch the arrest. I've been asked since why I turned away, and the honest answer is that I had already gotten everything I needed from that stage. I didn't need to watch him being led out of a ballroom in handcuffs to know that the man who spent 6 months quietly poisoning my sense of reality, timed his cruelty to the week my mother died, and believed he'd walked away clean with $11 million of debt safely reassigned to an unstable ex-wife, had just lost his company, his freedom, and every relationship in that room in the span of 11 minutes. I walked off that stage into a wall of quiet, stunned applause I hadn't anticipated and didn't particularly need, and Arthur met me at the bottom of the steps with my coat already in his hands. The following 6 months were not glamorous. Rebuilding never is. I spent them in depositions, in Diane's office reviewing filings, in Renata's office above the bakery going through the final asset transfers as Vance & Partners' remaining holdings came under my control through the defaulted debt. Julian was indicted on charges including fraud upon the court and administering a controlled substance without consent, and took a plea agreement 11 months later that included restitution and a 5-year sentence. Elena's involvement in the fraud was significant enough that she faced her own civil suit from me over the stolen designs, which I settled for a public retraction and a permanent injunction against her using any of my archived work again. She left Boston's design community entirely within the year. I kept the Beacon Hill Chapel project. I kept my mother's trust, fully intact. $35 million I used, over the following 2 years, to found a restoration fund in her name, dedicated to preserving historic properties across New England that private developers had written off as unprofitable. I also, somewhat to my own surprise, kept the Seaport project, the one Julian had nearly destroyed us both trying to save, and finished it the way it should have been built from the beginning, using the actual restoration philosophy Julian had spent 9 years telling people he understood but never once practiced. I stood in that finished building 18 months after the gala, looking out at the harbor through windows I had personally chosen, and I thought about the woman who had stood in a glass office holding a manila folder, waiting to save a marriage that had already been erased without her knowledge 62 days earlier. I didn't disappear the way Julian and Elena had planned for me to disappear. I didn't stay quiet, and I didn't stay broken, and I certainly didn't stay grateful for whatever small, damaged version of my life they thought I'd be left to accept. I rebuilt. That's what I've always done, and it turns out it was the one thing neither of them ever fully understood about me, right up until the moment it cost them everything.